All right. Well, again, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Amanda Callanan. I'm the Vice President of Communications at the Claremont Institute. And we're delighted to see you all here this evening. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who are not familiar with the Claremont Institute, we're a California-based think tank focused on teaching the American principles, the principles of the American founding. Most notably, we run 4 fellowship programs: the Lincoln Fellowship, Publius, John Marshall, and our newest program, the Speechwriters Fellowship, here in Washington, D.C. And additionally, we publish our flagship publication, the Claremont Review of Books, many of which you all are probably familiar with, as the cover essay of our summer issue is the focus of our conversation tonight, an essay titled, "Why Hasn't Brexit Happened Yet?" And I'm delighted that we're joined here this evening with the author of that essay, Christopher Caldwell, who will be properly introduced in just a moment. But before that, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Anton, who will lead tonight's conversation. Michael is a lecturer and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. He is also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and a regular contributor to the Claremont Review of Books. Previously, he served in the Trump administration as Deputy Assistant to the President for Strategic Communications. He holds degrees from the University of California at Davis, St. John's College, and Claremont Graduate University. He is a highly sought-after writer and commentator whose work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Fox News, to name a few. But most famously, in September 2016, under the pseudonym Publius Decius Mus, he published a famously provocative essay titled The Flight 93 Election, which he later adapted into a book titled After the Flight 93 Election, The Vote That Saved America and What We Still Have to Lose, which I encourage everyone here, if you haven't already, to read both the book and the essay that prompted it. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Michael to get things started and introduce Christopher Caldwell. Thank you.
On and yet, oh, there we go. I'll keep this short because I know you're all here to hear Chris Caldwell and not me. I'm here to hear Chris Caldwell and not me, so I'm in the same boat with you. Not that long ago, maybe 6 months ago this year, I happened to be talking to, well, actually, I do want to say this. When I got wind of the circumstances that Chris Caldwell would soon become unemployed, the first thing I did was I called the president of the Claremont Institute, Ryan Williams, and I said, Ryan, you need to immediately hire Chris Caldwell, which he did. So I take credit for that. Now, Ryan today says, oh, I already had that idea, to which I say, well, that's not what you said at the time, but even if that's true, Ryan, give me my moment, please. Come on. So after this happened, I told somebody, sort of a Washington-type person at a gathering much like this, you know, we hired Chris Caldwell, and I was the one who thought of that. And that person said to me, that guy is a national treasure. Chris doesn't know this, but spring it on him now. He is a national treasure. If you haven't read 2009's Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, a book that remains highly relevant, buy it immediately and read it. And unfortunately, his latest book will not be on sale for another, I don't know, 3 months. I managed to get the galleys and read it, and it's really mind-blowing. It's how good it is, how much it explains of things that you were dimly aware of, that you didn't really know. How does this all fit together? He tells you how it fits together. I think it's going to be a huge intellectual and possibly publishing sensation. It may sell so many copies. My fear is it'll sell so many copies, Chris will make so much money, he's just going to disappear to a Caribbean island and none of us are ever going to see him again. He will have deserved it, though. When you see the book, you'll know why. All right, now we're going to get on to the topic at hand. I want to congratulate Chris for having chosen this evening, the timing so perfectly, when we've just been through this wretched weekend of back and forth over Brexit. It seems like a microcosm of the 3 years of back and forth where you never know, it's going to happen, it's not going to happen, it's going to happen light, it's going to happen heavy, it's going to be, you know, there's going to be a deal, it's going to be no deal, and you never know from one moment to another. Now here we are on Monday, and the uncertainty that's encapsulated this whole process seems to have only been heightened by today. So the first question is a two-part question, which is, this is a difficult story to follow. If you don't want to spend your every day reading every detail, which is boring and hard, then you probably don't know what's going on. So what has gone on, and I think they do that on purpose. I think the people running the anti-Brexit campaign make it complicated to put us all to sleep so that we don't pay attention to what they're doing. So the title of your essay, Why Hasn't Brexit Happened? So why hasn't it happened? What's been going on for the last 3 years? And then specifically the last 3 days, this was supposed to be kind of crunch time, the end. We're all going to get a resolution, and we still don't have a resolution. Why not? And can you explain that?
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Michael. I think I should also explain that Mike alluded to the circumstances of my unemployment. When I heard the circumstances of unemployment, they're all totally innocent. I didn't do anything wrong or anything like that. It's just that the magazine I was working for before the Claremont Review, the Weekly Standard, died.
I only left that out because I thought people would think, oh, there goes Anton dancing on a neocon grave, and I didn't want to give that impression, right? I feel bad for some of the people who lost their jobs.
Yeah, I just didn't want to leave the impression I got arrested or anything. If we could go back a little further than 3 years, just to have a couple of words about what the European Union is and Britain's sort of uneasy position within it. The European Union is something that that a number of statesmen, kind of Atlanticist statesmen, preeminently Jean Monnet of France, began envisioning during World War II and then began to lay the institutional groundwork for in the 1950s. When the United States failed to unite Europe militarily against the communist threat, the European Coal and Steel Union, which was the first version of what we now know as the European Union, was kind of a substitute. The United States was very sympathetic to it in the early going. It seemed to reduce economic frictions. It seemed to increase solidarity in Western Europe. And Churchill liked it too, though he wanted Britain out of it. He explicitly, people today talk about Churchill supported the European Union. Well, yes, he did, on the condition that Britain not be in it, okay? In 1963, I believe, Britain made an attempt to join. It was vetoed by Charles de Gaulle in France, who said Britain was not temperamentally or institutionally European enough, and it would screw up the whole thing. It didn't belong in Europe. But influential people, particularly in the Tory party in the 1960s, continued wanting to join, and Edward Heath brought Britain into the European Union in 1973. In 1975, there was a referendum in which voters ratified by a large margin European membership. But in the early 1990s, Europe changed. There was a treaty between the European countries, the Maastricht Treaty, which transformed the European Economic Community into the European Union, and at that point envisioned what they called an ever closer union that was going to bind Europe together. It became a governing project. And at that point, I would say the vast majority of voters in the Tory party said no thank you. That alienated about half of British people. However, there was a problem. It did not alienate half of British politicians. And so you had a situation in which the Tory party became about 75% Brexit at its base, but only a few dozen people were in favor of Brexit, you know, at the leadership level. So there was this widespread sentiment of discontent about the European Union and its increasing pretensions to govern the countries, but there seemed to be no way of getting out of it until David Cameron ran into difficulties about 5 years ago and found himself obliged to promise a referendum to the British people on withdrawing from the European Union. He never thought that it would pass, but it passed. And when it passed, people assumed that it would sort of be self-enacting, but it wasn't. And these and the parliamentarians first, but then all sorts of other elite organizations. The Supreme Court, which has really only been in force for about only been a going thing for about a decade. Various other courts, various bureaucracies have sought to stop this vote of Brexit. And that's what leaves us where we are today.
Within your capsule history, what sticks out for me, and I've made this argument before, so I want to hear what you think of it. It seems to me there's an element of fraud, for lack of a better term, at the founding of the European Union. They promise limited goals. Every decade or decade and a half or so, they expand the goals, and then they say, this is what we meant all along. Maybe you weren't listening. So it starts out as the coal and steel. I thought it was the coal and steel community, but whatever. It becomes GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. It becomes...
That's something different. That's the World Trade Organization.
Part of it.
Yeah.
It becomes, then it's the European Economic Community, the EEC, and it only becomes the Union, late
92.
80s? 92, okay, so even later than I thought. And originally the idea is, well, let's just reduce trade barriers so we can save money. Let's reduce, the original idea is, let's reconcile France and Germany so they don't start another war and drag us all into it and kill everybody. Okay. Reduce trade barriers, we'll all make more money. But nobody who signed up originally thought that Brussels is going to tell me how big my vegetables can be, or that there will be some supranational court that can overturn a duly enacted law of a national legislature. And yet all of that happened. So my view is, I'd be interested to hear your view, the people who set this up knew what they were doing from the beginning, and they were pulling a fast one, and the people feel betrayed. What do you think of that?
I think it's a little bit different than that. I think this question varies from country to country. Now, Maastricht had to be ratified. Maastricht is the treaty in which Europe transformed itself from an economic union into a political union. Some countries had referenda. Some countries had votes, very contentious votes. At the time of Maastricht, it was said, okay, we're going off in a new direction, okay? It varied from country to country how much say people felt they had. But that brought a division with Britain. Most of these countries were either through referenda or through their representatives okay with this. But it brought a schism with Britain, and that is because the European Union's institutions were patterned on continental European institutions. And Britain didn't really have anything like them. Let's take, for instance, the European Commission, okay, which is a non-elected body, which has tended to be made up of career politicians who've been thrown out by the home electorate, and each country gets to pick one, and they get a kind of a czar-like role, managing some area of European life, like antitrust or education or agriculture. The European Union is an unelected body that can initiate legislation, okay? The European Parliament is a legislature that is not allowed to legislate on a majority of the issues that we consider, matters of popular suffrage. So the European Union's institutions are somewhat familiar to continental countries, but totally unfamiliar to Britain. And this has a lot of different effects. One, they consider them unfair, and they consider them, as Michael would say, a fraud. So in British eyes, yeah, they're a fraud. But there's another problem, which is the British don't have any practice in these institutions. They have a very different, their politicians are brought up in a very different kind of democracy. So they can't master this system. So they always feel like they're having the wool pulled over their eyes. So it's different for Britain than it is for the other countries.
So here's another way it's different for Britain than the other countries. I'd ask you to expand on this. I think I'm right to say that of the 29 members, Britain is the only country that did not join the common currency, right? Kept its own currency.
No, there are about there are a handful of them. There are half dozen.
Of the major economy. I mean, Italy is on it. France. I mean, this has caused a lot of pain in the European economy, or since the financial crisis. These southern European countries, like Spain, Italy, Greece, really don't like to be en hoc to Frankfurt and so on, or at the justice of the European Central Bank, which is run by the Germans. Britain deliberately chose not to get, as of the lone among the major economies of Europe at any rate, deliberately chose not to get on the euro, which suggests an early ambivalence about this, even from those British politicians who wanted to get into the euro, that they wanted to, or they get into the EU, they wanted to be half in and half out. What do you make of that, and how does that sentiment drive what's going on today?
You have that exactly right, that they do want to be half in, half out. As far as the euro is concerned, yes, Britain demanded a pass on the euro. Denmark demanded and obtained a pass on the euro. Sweden did not obtain a pass on the euro, but never adopted it anyway. So you have those three countries in northwestern Europe that aren't on it. Then you have most of the new countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe are not in the euro either. A key thing about Britain is economic. I mean, this plays into Brexit a great deal. London has some claim to be the financial capital of the world, not just Europe. It does a lot of mediation between the European Union and other countries around the world. You know, the growing economies of Asia and the rest of the world. That's London's role. This is one of the things that has led anti-Brexit politicians to say, look, you're making a big mistake here. Your link to Europe allows you to be, in essence, the agent for this, this market of 400 million people. It's not an argument without merit, but I think that Britain, which had an independent central bank, and despite a period of gross macroeconomic mismanagement in the 1970s, a pretty well-functioning economy, and really the only modern economy in Europe, in 1992. Britain was very cautious about it, and it was primarily Gordon Brown, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time when the transition was made to the euro in 2002, who created a test. If we will join, Tony Blair was very eager to join the euro. Gordon Brown said, well, hold off a second. We have a 4-point or a 5-point test. And when Europe does this and this and this and has proved itself, we will join. But Europe had not proved itself by the time the euro collapsed in 2008 to 2010, or nearly collapsed. So Britain has never joined it and won't join it. There's a second thing about the euro, which is it has been used. There's a second thing about the euro, aside from the liabilities that countries that are in it take on by being in the eurozone, and that is, it has been used to pressure governments into changing governments, as it was in both Greece and Italy in 2011.
Changing governments and essentially dictating fiscal policy from, well, Frankfurt, really. You could say Frankfurt and
Yes.
Lyon, but it's really Frankfurt.
Yes.
So I have a larger question, but maybe before I get to that, I want to ask a somewhat smaller but very interesting question, because you mentioned the British Supreme Court, which is a recent innovation. To me, one of the most interesting and best parts of your article was where you used, I think the analogy was, judicial review has become, for a transnational elite, something you just expect in a place where you do business, like a hairdryer in a hotel room. If it's not there, you know you're in a cheap motel. If you don't have judicial review, where the elites can override a democratically elected majority, you know you're not in a serious country for big business. Now, I want you to elaborate on that as a concept, but also, how was the Supreme Court layered on top of the British Constitution after however many centuries without it?
All right. Britain in the 1990s and in the first decade of this century it acquired a lot of what British people describe as constitutional bolt-ons. Tony Blair had a very modernizing view of Britain. It almost in a kind of a, you know, in a very business. He had a very business, public relations idea of Britain. You remember Blair was talking about cool Britannia and rebranding Britain and things like this. And I think that he really thought the United States was the way to go. It had a really modern. He liked the American system. Both Blair and Brown were very Americanophile. But I think the real source of the Supreme Court is that Blair passed, shortly after he came into office, something called the Human Rights Act. And this was a very confusing thing constitutionally, because what it did was it imported the entire European human rights charter into European, into British law. And it made British law subject to the European Convention on Human Rights. This created a strange situation where Britain had, on the one hand, a lot of laws that it had voted for governing what you could and couldn't do to someone, and another set of laws that it had never voted for, but which were called superior under the European treaties, because one of the things you grant when you join the European Union is you say European law is superior to our law. So all these situations arose in which judges had to decide, well, what is our rule about giving a hearing to immigrants? Because we have this law that passed Parliament, 10 years ago that says this, but there was a case in Slovakia 3 years ago that says this. The Supreme Court was established in 2005 and came into force in 2009 to decide these questions. So it actually, and this is an interesting aspect of the Brexit debate, about a month ago, the Supreme Court issued a decision on Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament. That is, he had shut down Parliament in an irregular way. I don't really want to go into the details of the case. It is probable that Johnson was trying to do what the Supreme Court said he was trying to do, which is shorten the period of debate on Brexit. But the interesting thing is that Brexit is basically, at its root, it is a demand from the British public that the government return to the traditional way of governing and stop going down the road to this new way of governing that's represented by Europe. That is, that the government return to a parliamentary style of government and stop its progress and reject this new sort of European, let's say, human rights-based government. And yet, at the heart of Brexit, all of the decisions are being made by the very institutions that were repudiated in Brexit itself, you see? So you have a real situation in which each side is totally totally operating in its own context, you see? They have two different ideas of fairness. And that's the problem with Brexit.
Just staying for a moment with the Supreme Court, as you know, our own Supreme Court has long been a matter of regime controversy here in the United States. I mean, there are some who think that that the power of judicial review it asserted in the early 19th century is made up, is unconstitutional. Others would say it's fine as long as it keeps it to a very limited sense of striking down only laws that are plainly against the text of the written Constitution. And then most of us, I think in this room, would say That's not what it does anymore and hasn't been doing for a long time. It does all kinds of things based on a broader conception of law, transnational law, international law, philosophic concepts, theories from the university, and things like that. So it sounds like the British sort of went from nothing straight to the end point of our own Supreme Court system without even trying the middle way, which would be in any case difficult for them since they don't have a written constitution. Maybe the best thing to do would have not been to do this at all, which leads to the question. You say a lot of these people, at a minimum, they want no further march in this direction, and a lot of them would want to go back. I'm having a hard time, and I think about this a lot, thinking of cases where transnational or trans-institutional, or whatever we want to call it, governance has been rolled back in the last 50 years. Can you give us some examples, or is there any reason for the British people to hope that they can actually, turn some of this around?
That's why Brexit is such a big deal. This is it. This is the moment, okay? So Britain is the country that invented the system of rules that we have. Britain invented the idea of liberty that we have, right? But there's a new idea of liberty that's about, a new improved idea of liberty, you might call it. And this is the first attempt, actually, to restore an older understanding of liberty that is in the process of being supplanted. I think that's why it's so pivotal.
So the gist of your article to me was, you can be completely, now, okay, some people like to argue, well, it was 52 to 48, and that was the percentage, right? And, well, it's hardly a landslide. On the other hand, unless my memory is bad, that's more than any US president has won the popular vote by since 1988. Right? I mean, I don't think anyone has come close. Well, did Obama do better than that in 2012? I think a little under. Bush, even more under. Obviously, Clinton never won the popular vote either time. Trump didn't win it, and so on. 52 to 48, I mean, it's pretty good. If I were running for president of the United States today, I'd be quite happy with 52 to 48. I would almost consider that a mandate. But now we're supposedly told it's incredibly narrow and hardly matters. The thing that I take from your argument, though, is you can have a fairly sizable majority in favor of something and completely outnumber the people who want to keep it or who want whatever you don't want, and they can beat you every time. And that's what seems to be happening with the Brexit case, and it's what seems to be happening all over the world, including here in the United States. This seems to be a problem of global governance, that electoral majorities, popular majorities, public opinion majorities just can't move. They can't move the government. They can't set policy. What accounts for that?
You can say it's a problem, but if you're a Remainer, you wouldn't see it as a problem. You'd see it as, you would probably see it, and here I'm speculating and I'm going to get very abstract, you would probably see this as a new form of balance in the government, a new form of balance of powers. So you seem to have majorities or emerging majorities for populist programs in a lot of these countries. But where you see them, you also see anti-populist control of institutions. And basically, it is these new institutions that are the lines of defense that elites have thrown up against popular majorities. I think you probably see fewer referenda in the future too in some of these countries,
Well, yeah, on that specifically, I mean, the old joke used to be, I remember being in college and grad school when a lot of the original Maastricht referenda were going on, and occasionally a country would have the temerity to vote no, and they would always be faced with the prospect of voting again. Wait, you returned the wrong answer. We're going to give you another try. But as soon as you return the right answer, there are no more votes. There's a phrase for that. One man, one vote, once, or twice if you vote the wrong way the first time. So there was a specter of people saying, why don't we have another referendum? Which clearly meant, so you can change your mind, but it seems to be the people pushing that are chickening out because they fear, oh Lord, they'll probably just vote for it again by a higher margin.
I don't know that they're chickening out. I believe that actually that is the end goal of the resistance to Brexit right now. Certainly, you should go online and read The Independent, which is the most monomaniacal newspaper I've ever seen. the entirety of the newspaper is about a second vote, which they have two names for. One is they call it a final say, and the other is they call it the other one is better though. The other one is they call it a people's vote. We want so the Independent is always calling for a final say or a people's vote. There has been a lot of talk about designing this second referendum, and one of the features about most plans for the second referendum is that it should have not two, but it should be improved to have three options on it. So there would be whatever deal Boris Johnson has, there would be a no-deal Brexit, and there would be Remain. So, you can break it into three pieces so as better to examine the options.
Okay, this is a question I've been waiting to ask for a while. I think it's important. Why? I think you've explained the passion on the exit side. I'm assuming the audience understands why the people who want to get out want to get out. What explains elite tenacity to stay in? What do, for politicians, maybe it's obvious. You get a seat on the European Commission if you get, booted out of office. There are more jobs and limos and junkets and things like that. But for elites not in politics, for the business elites, for the intellectual elites, the academic elites, the journalists, and so on, why are they so passionately committed to this? What do they get out of it?
Because they think it's right, and there are a lot of ways to explain that, but basically, I'd like to focus on the sociological way, if you don't mind. It might help to look at the way people try to explain the Trump vote and the resistance to it. There are a lot of reasons for both Trump support and Trump opposition. But analysts often focus on the economy, okay? You have, there are people who, are working in Silicon Valley, sort of like, designing virtual reality games, and they don't like Trump. And there are people addicted to OxyContin in Western Pennsylvania, and that's Trump's people. And it's kind of an oversimplification, but there is an economic element to this. And I would say that the new economy, a key thing is the new economy is a new economy. This has been a real economic revolution. It is not like the economic change we had during industrialism. It is not where you introduce new machines and you keep doing the same stuff but more efficiently. It is the old jobs die and new people do new jobs. And the people who used to do the old jobs, they're just left out, okay? What is a modern city? A modern city is a place, a 21st century city is a place where the global economy goes on, where the new economy goes on. They have computers, they have servants, they have a lot of landscapers from the third world. It's a totally different economy than it used to be, 50 years ago. And London is the 21st century city par excellence. I was looking for some reason at statistics on robotics and deindustrialization and things. All Western countries have deindustrialized. But if you look at, they've deindustrialized to a greater and lesser extent. Germany's lost about a third of its industrial jobs. The United States and France have lost about half of their industrial jobs. Britain has lost 3/4 of its industrial jobs, which is actually not if you watch old movies, this is not the stereotype you have of Britain, okay? You think of Britain as like, shipyards and coal mills and, sort of like, Monty Python routines about, trouble down at the mill. But Britain's not that. Britain is has been since 1986, when it had a complete deregulation of the financial industry, has been the most financialized economy in the world. So, you have people in a place like London who, first of all, think of this new order, this European order, as just economic common sense, because it works for them. And the old alternative, you know, what was Britain like 30 or 40 years ago? Well, geez, the unions were running everything, you know. We had to go to the IMF to beg for money. It was pretty bad, you know. So these people live among each other. It seems to make economic sense. Then you have young people who've been brought up with European institutions, which are the source of a lot of their, on the one hand, they've been educated in these institutions, all right? So they are told that the European Union was put together to keep Europe from ever going to war again, that it's about bringing peoples together, it's about love, it's about cosmopolitanism, it's about learning, it's about going to see Paris. And there are institutions that are very well funded that promote this. If you're a good student, you can get an Erasmus scholarship. You can go study in Paris or Venice or Florence or other nice places. You can go to Krakow. You can go to, you know, and these people can come to you, and you get you know, there's no longer just the awful British coffee you used to get in the 1980s. There's espresso. It's also wonderful if you and so if you inhabit the 21st century economy, the European Union looks like common sense. If you do not inhabit the 21st century economy, then the European Union looks like the mechanism by which you were ejected from your old place in society. And I would guess that the majority for Brexit indicates there are more ejectees than there are sort of people enjoying it.
I'm going to, feel free to dispute this. I'm going to read just a slight note of cynicism into what you just said, because you began with saying because they think it's right, which I think is true, but there's also a reality, though, that a lot of people are making a lot of money off this, and they stand to lose. Now, I don't think that, this is where I think they get hysterical. You correct me if I'm wrong. If Brexit were to go through, London is not going to collapse either the next day or within the next 5 years or 10 years. But certain people's profit margins may narrow or decline, but Britain's not going to revert to Dickensian coal mines and wool mills, right? I mean, Britain will still remain a 21st century economy, but maybe on slightly different terms. And the people who are for this, at least those who are the wisest and the sharpest, see that and don't want it to happen. That's the sense that I have of it. Is that wrong?
I don't know. I'm not cynical about this. I do think that there is a sincerity in this 48%. There are, I mean, and these 48% I think are at some level voting their interests. Yes, there are a handful of people who are making a lot of money out of the order as it is. But I think anyone who benefits from the order as it is will back it. And when you say that, you know, and there are some people making a little bit of money from the, they feel they're better off under the order as it is than they would have been under another order. And I actually know I don't doubt their sincerity in it. This is a real dramatic choice for Britain. It's going to be really, half the country is going to be really disappointed constitutionally in the result, whichever way it goes. But, you know.
Okay, half the country is going to be really disappointed whichever way it goes. Britain
I want to make clear that only one of the outcomes is legitimate in terms of the referendum that passed, you see?
In terms of the referendum, although this is different what I was about to say, but your own article, and I have an advantage over the audience having read your book, the Remainers would say, based on the new conception, the new, better, truer, only recently discovered, but not therefore made up, simply recently discovered and better understanding of rights and all of this, we're more legitimate. You guys just had a tantrum and made a bad decision, and we're going to save you from yourselves. So legitimate is a difficult one in this case, isn't it? Because nobody's going to this could go through, and the Remainers aren't going to say it was legitimate just because it had one vote one time. They're going to say this contravenes the same way we would say that a duly passed law by the U.S. Congress that even we conservatives would say a law passed by the U.S. Congress that blatantly contradicts a provision or an amendment to the Constitution isn't legitimate, even if it was, passed unanimously.
And that's what you have. You have from the interior of each side's logic, the other side appears to be acting without legitimacy. To Brexit, the Remainers are defying democracy. And to Remain, the Brexiters are pursuing an antiquated and bigoted conception of the national interest.
So Britain hasn't really fundamentally broken itself since 1640. What are the chances that this unsatisfying either way outcome, it won't presumably lead to the Civil War and the severing of the head of a monarch in Whitehall Palace again, although one never knows, but I doubt it. What are the chances, though, that this leads to some real civil strife or just a kind of permanent estrangement from two populations that don't know how to talk to one another or get along with one another?
Civil strife, I hope I'm correct in this. I believe the chance is low. And it's not that the tinder is not present for civil strife. It's just that there's not the mojo for it. Britain does not have enough young people. It does not have enough it does not have enough ambition for people to really go out and begin causing trouble for one another. However, it does have this. It has ruined a lot of friendships. It's broken up marriages. It really has cut the country in two. I would say as much as they have as big a division as we do here. Probably bigger.
Probably bigger, right?
Yeah. Because they really are talking about the constitutional destiny of the country.
Knowing what I know about it, it's which is the average layperson knows about it, right? It's a big city phenomena. It's an elite intellectual phenomena. But regionally, it's the only place it's strong in a widespread way. That is to say, Remain is Scotland. The rest of the hinterlands, if you were to call it, if you were to say Red State Britain, if there were such a thing, is Brexit. So it's much harder to envision the country breaking down in any way, except for the old traditional city versus the country. What are the chances then, if whatever way it goes, if it goes through or if it doesn't go through, for some kind of serious devolution of power and authority to say, look, we don't like each other, we don't understand each other, neither one of us has any place to go, we're all stuck here, but let us run our little hamlets the way we want to, and you can run West London the way you want to, and we don't really have to talk that much otherwise. What are the chances of something like that?
Well, the chances of devolution are dangerously high, but they wouldn't take that form. And that is because, and this is very complicated, and I don't want to get into a whole different consideration, but when I spoke earlier about the constitutional bolt-ons of the 1990s that Tony Blair put in, you must give pride of place to the devolved governments that the devolution of governments in Scotland and Wales, which Tony Blair had the idea of decentralization. Tony Blair went to, although he's English, he went to prep school in Scotland. He's very fond of Scotland. Gordon Brown is Scottish. There were a lot of Scots in New Labour, and this seemed like a kind of a neat project to give Scotland a lot of pride.
But it was also a way, correct me if I'm wrong, to head off a Scottish independence movement.
I don't think so. No.
No?
It was not the devolution was not introduced at a particular crest for Scottish independence. So I think there's been more Scottish independence agitation since then than there was before. But I will just say that when you talk about devolution, there is the danger of Scotland winning a barely winning a national referendum of the sort that, like Catalonia would like to have.
Well, but they lost. I forgot the year, but the Scottish,
lost,
yeah.
but they're talking about Indie Ref 2, as they call it.
If Brexit were to go through, and since Scotland, by and large, regionally is the most strongly remain part of the country, it's the only regionally unified part of the country.
Northern Ireland is
Northern Ireland, for different reasons. Would they try to vote again, and do you think they would leave the UK?
That's a complicated thing. I mean, the simplest view of the question is yes, Brexit makes Scotland more likely to secede from the UK. But actually, Brexit might so weaken the European Union that it would cause Scotland to think twice, because Scottish nationalism, like Catalan nationalism, is not a fully developed nationalism. That is, in both cases, the countries are not talking about having a Scottish or a Catalonian air force and their own currency. It's kind of they're kind of able to indulge this independentist sentiment because they are wrapped into larger structures. These are regional independences. They're not like full nation-state independences, you see? So to the extent that the European Union is weakened, it might weaken the case for Scots independence. I would say, to answer your question about devolution and the areas of the country that are anti-Brexit are London, Oxford, Cambridge, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And the rest of the country looks pretty much like the American county Trump map if you go across the Midwest and the mountain states. It is pure red. It is pure Brexit, and you can travel from one end of the country to another without going through an anti-Brexit district.
Presumably, if Scotland were to get out of the Union, it would get on the euro. I don't know, that's neither here nor there, but and that would be one way that it would maintain its ties. But what you said, the other thing you said, I think is more important and more interesting, that Brexit weakens the EU. Clearly, the leaders of the EU understand that and feel it intuitively, which is why they're fighting it. Now, the conventional understanding, which I tend to adopt because it fits my worldview, but again, I may be wrong, I'm asking you, is they fear Brexit because they know the EU has become a bad deal from all but the handful of countries, which really comes down to two, and really in the end comes down to one, that truly run the EU. And if you let one out, there's going to be a stampede for the door. Is that about right?
That was the French thinking going into the negotiations, and that is why that goes a long way to explain why Brexit has evolved in the kind of counterproductive way that it has, because Britain went into the negotiations saying, and this has always been the Brexit position, the Brexiters have no enmity towards Europe. They say, Boris Johnson, more than anyone, was saying, I am a European, I am a cosmopolitan, I can sing Ode to Joy in German, I can recite Homer in Greek, that kind of thing. And so Britain went into the negotiations trying to be very conciliatory. The European negotiators, led by Michel Barnier of France, went in understanding that they really had to punish Britain to the maximum extent possible in order to prevent other countries, such as, for instance, Italy, which has similar grievances to Britain, from voting the similar way in a referendum of their own. And the problem was that you wound up with, a conciliatory Britain, a punitive France. You wound up with a deal that was so bad for Britain that it couldn't pass. And so, you're in this contentious period right now.
Okay, continuing on the same thread, part of me understands why, for instance, the countries that had been part of the Warsaw Pact, liberated by the end of the Soviet Empire, they really wanted to join the EU, despite what I would consider from afar, I would say it was against their best interests. But their view was, this is a more symbolic than anything. It's symbolic of, we're finally free, we're finally part of the community we should have been part of all along. There's a sense that even prior to the Soviet Empire, these nations, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, all the parts of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire were considered sort of Europe Junior or Europe Light, not real members, and they wanted to prove for once and all that they had always belonged there, and were willing to pay the price of the busybodies and the meddlesome bureaucracy and the taxes and all of that. These countries right now seem to be, second only to Brexit, on the forefront of defying Brussels, and yet they have not taken the psychological step of even asking the question, maybe we just don't belong in this union if we're going to be told constantly, we can't do this and we can't do that. I mean, Hungary is a great example, which has taken on Brussels over and over again over the migrant question, and is stalwart in standing up to Brussels. But I don't sense, you've been there recently, that, by the way, before he wrote about Brexit, ladies and gentlemen, his story for the CRB was about Hungary, where Mr. Caldwell spent something like 10 days talking to everyone, including the Mr. Orban. What is the sense of public opinion and elite opinion in those countries? Have they even begun to sour on the concept, or at least on their own membership?
Right. So Hungary is a good example. I think you have it exactly right when you talk about the symbolic power of Europe. And when you look at a map of Hungary, it looks like a bullseye. It's like a circle. If we're talking like the color of Fidesz, which is Prime Minister Orban's party, is orange, and they mark the whole country with orange, and there's just one dot in the middle, and that's Budapest, and that's the only place that doesn't vote for him. I think there might be one town in the south, like Szeged or something, that doesn't vote Orban, but the entire countryside is for him. The Budapest intelligentsia and business elite is against him. But Orban is winning elections by saying things like, we want to chart our own course in terms of immigration policy. I think most European countries, most European populations feel that. But the one thing he never says is we want to get out of the European Union. And a lot of his suggestions involve sort of like spreading his policies continent-wide in the European Union. The symbolic, the need of Hungarians, especially after having their country chopped up in 1920, the need of Hungarians to feel secure in the middle of Europe is great. I mean, and so I think that while you do have politicians, preeminent among them, Václav Klaus of the Czech Republic, who has always taken the position of like, I didn't fight communism in order to sort of like be told, that I can't spank my kids by some Swedish bureaucrat, you know what I mean? There have always been politicians like that who do consider the European Union a trespass on their democratic prerogatives and oppose it for that reason. But most Eastern European politicians don't.
I think we're being cut off, but since I have a microphone and I'm here, I will make one or two small editorial comments. First of all, it seems to me if the European Union makes any sense, it would realign itself along Orbanist lines and say, we're the European Union. We exist for Europeans, so we should protect the continent from a migration crisis, not welcome it or try to shift the costs onto southern, or so on and so forth. He's being more European than Brussels is, but what do I know?
No. Only under the old dispensation.
Right. Well, I adhere to the old dispensation.
These two different governing systems are two different metaphysics. And when the European Union politicians talk about European values, that's what they mean by Europe. They mean relatively open borders and that sort of thing. They don't mean they don't mean the values. They mean ethics. They don't mean historical values that Europe has had. Do you see
Well,
what I mean?
I could justify my position
Yeah.
on an appeal to abstract ethics, but I won't right now. And then, I mean, the last thing, the main takeaway for me here, and every question I asked was sort of intended to at least tangentially bring out what are the parallels between what they're going through and what we're going through here. Because it does seem to be a global pattern, at least in the United States, Canada, Europe, Austria, New Zealand, less so in the advanced economies of Northeast Asia, that some of these trends have bypassed, where there's just a giant dichotomy between metropolitan job-producing, capital-intensive centers and intellectual centers such as university towns and so on, and everywhere else. And we all still live with one another, and we carry the same passports more or less, but we don't seem to have anything in common, and the trend seems to have established itself, entrenched itself, and intensified over my lifetime. I don't see any retreat at all. I don't really know where this is going, but I look forward with trepidation based on what I'm seeing, and it doesn't seem like this is a problem unique to Britain or America. It's endemic everywhere. It seems to be something that's just taken hold of, that part of the OECD, which is a UN gobbledygook term for rich country, minus, Japan and a couple of others that have just decided, we'll join your economy, but we're not adopting these other practices.
I think you've got it. And yeah, I think there are elements of it in even outside of, the Western Europe and the United States. If you look at India or the
Yeah.
Philippines, I mean, there are elements of this problem
Vietnam.
there.
And that's true. That's last point then. There are countries that haven't quite joined the system yet, but what they're doing is they seem to be cultivating and building an elite who thinks exactly like the elites in these OECD or these Western countries, but they just haven't opened up a wide enough gulf between the capital and the countryside yet. But they seem headed in that direction, and it doesn't seem like it will be long before countries that today we consider developing or third world or behind the curve, whatever their per capita income is relative to ours in their social structure, they're going to look just like us before long. Okay.
Thank you for the great talk. Couple of puzzling questions. Sorry, can you? Okay. A couple of puzzling questions. Okay, yeah. Oh, good. Okay. Thank you. Okay, yeah. A couple of puzzling questions. There's a paradox that even though Great Britain was outside of Schengen with a free circulation of people and outside the Euro, it is the one who actually managed to escape from the prison. You would think that maybe Italy or the Netherlands might have been the ones who may have wanted to get out of there. That's one question I wanted to maybe clarify. Another one is, there seems to be a coincidence or some sort of parallels that some people have brought up to my attention between the governance of the EU as it has become, having basically derailed, if you will, after 1992, and the Soviet Union, which happened to have broken up a year earlier in terms of, the commission that controls everything and somewhat rubber stamping parliament or whatever. And maybe if you think it makes sense if there are any parallels there that are worthwhile. And then after that, if you can comment on the sustainability of Great Britain under the demographic pressures from massive immigration from third world countries and whatnot. And also, of course, what would happen with Scotland with regards to the European Union, because would they even want Scotland, since technically, if I'm not mistaken, it is a net drain on the Great Britain economy. Thank you. Sorry about that.
You started with Schengen. It's funny that Schengen should be the, yeah. No, I actually think it probably helped Britain to be outside of Schengen. It allowed them to think of themselves as like they are an island apart. They're not. There are a whole bunch of problems and opportunities that come from having open land borders that Britain didn't have. And you see that the one thing that most threatened to derail Brexit thus far has been the so-called backstop with Northern Ireland. That's something we haven't talked to talked about much this evening, but maybe we could talk a little bit about that now. Ireland, has been recently. Ireland suffered under, guerrilla warfare for many decades in the 20th century until it was. Until that period was sort of brought to a close by something called the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. To simplify a little bit, what the Good Friday Agreement did was it actually was a very modern, very 21st century conception of things. It said that these two areas, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which belong to the UK, and the 26 counties of the Republic of Ireland, would grow together if they could be under the same economic regime. It basically took the economic regime as more important than the political regime. So when Brexit came, the Europeans presented the likely introduction of a hard border as an obstacle and as a potential thing that could damage Ireland. I think that they exaggerated the potential damage that could come of it, but it has been until recent weeks, until Boris Johnson negotiated this deal that would permit Britain to exit from a customs union with Ireland. It has been the biggest hang-up about Brexit. Your other things, I think you asked 3 more questions. The first was about the demographics of Britain and how it survives. Well, all these countries are changing very quickly, and they're all changing their composition very quickly. And that is, that is a big crisis for Europe, which I've written about elsewhere. It doesn't seem to have, I mean, it doesn't seem to have stopped Brexit. I think that you can, if you look at who votes for Brexit and who votes against, Brexit has tended to be more popular among the autochthonous population, if we can call it that, and Remain has been more popular among immigrants and children of immigrants. So.
I didn't know until this whole Brexit thing happened that there was a new Supreme Court of England, Britain, and I also didn't know that the Parliament couldn't call snap elections when it wanted when it lost a majority, and both of those were apparently reforms of the 90s and the early part of this century, and those reforms seem to be causing a lot of the uncertainty and problems. Do you see any party in the UK, particularly Boris, running on Brexit and we go back to parliamentary democracy? We can't have a Supreme Court with an unwritten constitution. I mean, I can't even imagine it. But also, and when you lose the support of Parliament, you call a new election.
Right. Okay. That's a great. That is a central question. We have already discussed the origins of the Supreme Court in 2005 to 2009. The law that the gentleman is talking about is called the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011. And it was passed by a coalition of David Cameron's Tories and Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats. David Cameron had campaigned, he'd worked very hard to change the Conservative Party for many years in hopes of ending Tony Blair and the Labour Party's dominance over British political life. And he failed. And it turned out the only way he could get into government after that election was by making a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, who were, they used to be the conservative wing of the Labour Party. They later became a very strongly anti-Iraq war party. They're now the main anti-Brexit party. But Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, worried he looked around at other countries in Europe and saw that anytime a small party joined a big one in a coalition, it got destroyed at the next election. And that's happened particularly in Germany. And so he said, I would like an assurance that you're not going to throw our party out. And so to solve this small tactical political problem, Cameron changed the Constitution. And so you now have a situation where the government cannot dissolve the government and call new elections on its own. It requires 2/3 of the House. So you're in a situation now where the Conservative Party had a medium-sized majority. Theresa May, Boris Johnson's predecessor, called an election, lost the majority. They had to form a coalition with an Ulster Unionist party. And so they had the narrowest of majorities. In the battle over Brexit, Boris Johnson has expelled certain members from the party. So now the Tory party, which it holds the prime ministership, it has the cabinet and the government, but it is well below a majority, and it's not even a minority government. They just don't have enough people to govern. And yet, Johnson's popularity keeps growing and growing, and the other parties are scared to death to give him an election. So they're not going to permit him to have Brexit, and they're not going to permit him to hold an election. Now, I would say, could he run on overturning the Fixed-Term Parliament Act? I think that should he win, he won't run on that. I think that's an inside baseball thing. Should he get the majority, there will be unanimity in his party to overturn that act. And I think that any governing party would see the damage that it's done to the British Constitution too. And so I think that's going to go in the next government, whether it's a Tory government or another one.
Why do you think, given you're looking at an educated class among the Remainers, why do you think that the notions of Switzerland and Norway have not gotten more traction? These aren't impoverished nations. Their GDP is far above the EU average. You can certainly understand the reluctance, but the visceral reaction seems bizarre given the fact that other nations can succeed outside of the EU who are on par with Britain.
Yeah. Switzerland and Norway are friendly to the EU, and they're aligned with the EU, but that's right, they are outside the EU. So why hasn't it occurred to Remainers that you can maintain, a European style of life without being in the European Union? And I think the answer to that would be that actually the Brexiters do have a deep-seated critique of this European style of life, of this, do you know what I mean? Of this European model. They have a genuine constitutional gripe. And a Britain that was removed from the European Union would not be like Norway or Switzerland, although Switzerland is a different example. Switzerland is a real proud, insular, different democracy. So I would say that actually the Brexiters would want something different than that. I think the difference is larger, and in fact that if you looked at Switzerland, you probably would find a large number of elites who would favor going into the European Union.
Thank you. This is really interesting. A couple of comments and then a question. One comment was on the votes for the European Union Treaty. Ireland and France, of course, were two major countries that said no. When the French public voted it down, and they were told they had voted wrong, the second vote was done only by elected representatives, and amazingly enough, they went to Versailles to have their vote. I found that absolutely extraordinary. But what they're doing with Brexit now, it seems to me, is using parliamentary techniques such as amendments and other such things. So could you now please tell us, do you think Brexit will pass or not?
What is going on today that Louise alluded to is Boris Johnson made a very intelligent strategic estimation. He figured that his biggest problem in Parliament to go back to the beginning, a majority in Parliament after the referendum voted to activate Article 50, which creates a 2-year timetable for Britain to leave the European Union. And at the end of the 2 years, Britain's out. And it will try to negotiate a deal with the European Union, but if it doesn't, it just leaves the European Union. Parliamentarians who, as I said, were anti-Brexit, why did they vote for this Article 50? They voted for Article 50 because they knew that they could not be seen to sort of like have voted for a referendum, and then when the referendum didn't go their way, to say, screw you. So they were scared. But once they had voted for Article 50, they discovered that there was a way to delay Brexit without seeming to delay Brexit. And that was to say that you would not accept Brexit with no deal. That is because that would mean crashing out of the European Union. But, and here is the problem, once you say, I will not accept Brexit unless we arrive at a deal, you say that the European Union has ultimate control over whether we're to have Brexit or not. And that changes the meaning of what the referendum was. If you really won't leave until the European Union says you can leave, well, then you haven't voted to leave the European Union. You voted to ask Europe's permission to leave the European Union. Johnson saw that as long as there was no deadline coming up, parliamentarians could play this game forever. So he said, when he ran, he said, we are going to leave the European Union on October 31st, do or die. And once that deadline was looming, that put a lot of pressure on people. And the goal has been to keep pushing it back, because the one thing the Remain forces cannot handle is a deadline, because that will require them to vote against Brexit. And they're frightened to vote against Brexit. They'll vote against a no-deal Brexit. Oh, I'm totally for Brexit. I just don't want a no-deal Brexit. You know what I mean? It's a crazy. It's a very interesting pretext. Okay, it's like if I owe you like $100, and I say, oh, I'm going to pay you the $100. I got the $100 right here. But no one has assured me that the money's not going to explode. Until I can be sure it won't explode, I won't put you at risk by paying you back. You know, it's that kind of thing. So this Boris Johnson, against all expectations, wound up getting a negotiated deal with the European Union. And yesterday, or let's say over the weekend, what happened is that Oliver Letwin, one of the former Conservative members, added a very strange amendment to the deal that said this deal can't go into effect until the legislation carrying out the deal is made. So you can't just vote on the deal. You have to create an entire apparatus for passing the deal and then vote on that before you can vote on the deal. And so Johnson is trying to work his way out of that. He tried to hold a vote on it today, and today the Speaker of the House, who is who's not the head of a delegation as he is here. He's not the head of a caucus. He was until very recently a sort of like a rule keeper or a referee for the House. But the present Speaker of the House who is an ardent Brexit opponent, has intervened with a lot of very controversial rule changes to retard Brexit. It's too complicated to go into at this point. But I would say that what Johnson is basically doing, okay, is trying through a long war of attrition he cannot keep the Remain forces from using one trick after another to stop him. But he can make it more and more obvious that that is what they're doing. Do you know what I mean? So what he is trying to do is he's trying to bring the true nature of the opposition to Brexit to the surface, you know, and he is succeeding. And as he does it, he's getting more and more popular. It might be possible for Parliament and Bercow to block this Brexit measure, but I don't think it's going to be possible to hold off an election forever. I think at a certain point it just becomes so manifestly against the interests of the public that there will be a clamor for it.
Okay, we can do one more quick question.
It's a can of worms question. I hope you'll forgive it. I was watching for several months the case in the Court of Queen's Bench, in which the parties that brought the case said, we are actually out by referendum by 2 votes of Parliament. We are no longer in the European Union as of March 19th. And I watched with particular hope. I have to tell you, show my colors here. I'm in favor of self-government in every instance. So with this particular referendum, I'm on the record as it being the most significant event in the world in favor of self-government since the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's just so you know what my colors are. But I've been watching with great interest that Boris Johnson's government ceded the argument about a month ago. But I lost track of what happened with that. I understand it's in some cases you can say it's OBE. You know which case I'm talking about?
No, I don't.
Okay,
I'm familiar with the argument, but I didn't realize that it had made it before.
Yes, it made its way in King's Bench, and the government officially, I can speak it to in American terms, but the vocabulary I don't have in the British terms, ceded the argument. So right. I wondered, is that Boris Johnson's putting something in his pocket that gives him tremendous leverage, and he discussed it with the Queen. We can always say, well, the Constitution, we're already gone. That's a tremendous something to pull out of your back.
Yeah, I don't know what the status of that of that is. No.
I have a question. Since he brought up the Queen, is there a point at which the monarch, I realize this is improbable, but you know, it's just by tradition that they don't use any of their powers anymore. Could she just say, all right, enough. I'm going to assert democracy since you voted on this. You've now elected 2 governments saying that they were going to carry this out, and I'm tired of all of these mandarins, none of whom I created or appointed, are blocking it, so get it done. Or is that just fanciful?
That would be a true constitutional crisis. But I you know, the closest that the royal prerogative, I think the closest that the monarch has come to using that prerogative in recent years was in, I think, 1974 when the governor of Australia, who is a royal, it's a royal office, deposed the government there. But I don't know. I don't see that happening. It's just for her entire life, the Queen has sort of operated under the modern understanding of how her prerogative is used, and it's getting rather late in her career to sort of like learn new tricks, I think.